Mayflower, A Story of Courage, Community, and War, by Nathaniel Philbrick. Introduction. Imagine a ship, not unlike the famous Mayflower, leaving the shores of New England in the year 1676. Like the Mayflower, it carries a human cargo, but this vessel is not sailing toward a new life of freedom. It's sailing away from it. This ship, the Seaflower, is bound for the Caribbean, and its hold is packed not with hopeful colonists, but with 180 Native American slaves. Men, women, and children, condemned to a life of perpetual slavery on sugar plantations. And the man who signed the papers, the man who sealed their fate, was none other than the governor of Plymouth colony himself, Josiah Winslow, the son of two of the original Mayflower passengers. How is this possible? How does a story that begins with a quest for religious freedom, a story of brave pilgrims and the first Thanksgiving, end just 56 years later with a slave ship? This is the question at the very heart of Nathaniel Philbrick's masterpiece, Mayflower. This isn't the simple, sanitized story you learned in elementary school. Philbrick, a National Book Award winner, peels back the layers of myth to reveal something far more complex, more troubling, and ultimately, more human. We think we know the story of the Pilgrims. But Philbrick argues that the real story, the one that truly matters, doesn't end with the first Thanksgiving feast. It begins there. It's the story of the next 50 years, a story of peace, struggle, and compromise between two cultures trying to live together. And it's the story of how that fragile peace shattered into one of the deadliest wars ever fought on American soil. Today, we are going to journey back to that beginning. Not just the beginning of Plymouth colony, but the beginning of America itself. By the end of our time together, you will understand that the Pilgrims were not the one-dimensional figures in black hats we imagine them to be. They were brilliant, flawed, courageous, and sometimes cruel. In other words, they were human. And their story is not just a piece of history. It is a mirror, reflecting the best and worst of what America would become. This isn't just the story we think we know. As Philbrick writes, it's the story we need to know. Book summary. Our story begins not in America, but in the small, damp farming towns of northern England at the turn of the 17th century. This is where we meet a young, orphaned boy named William Bradford. Struck by a long illness that kept him from the fields, Bradford found his companionship not with other children, but in the pages of the Bible. And what he read there changed his life forever. At the time, the Church of England was the only legal church, and King James I demanded absolute conformity. But a growing number of people, who had come to be known as Puritans, believed the church had been corrupted. They wanted to purify it, to strip away the ceremonies, the fancy robes, and the Book of Common Prayer, and return to the simple, direct worship they read about in the Bible. Within this movement was a more radical group, the Separatists. They didn't believe the Church of England could be fixed. Their only option, they felt, was to leave it entirely, an illegal and dangerous act. As a lonely teenager, William Bradford found his true family in a small, secret congregation of separatists who met in a nearby town called Scrooby. For the first time, he felt he belonged. But their secret could not last. In 1607, the authorities found them out. Some were thrown in prison, others had their homes watched. They knew they had to flee. Their first attempt to escape England was a disaster. The ship captain they hired betrayed them, stealing their money and turning them over to the authorities. On their second try, another captain panicked at the sight of the local militia and sailed away, leaving the women and children weeping on the shore as their husbands watched helplessly from the deck of the departing ship. Eventually, they were reunited and made their way to Leiden, a bustling city in the religiously tolerant country of Holland. For 12 years, they lived as exiles. They found safety, but life was hard. Most were farmers, But in the city, they were forced into menial jobs in the cloth industry, working from dawn to dusk. More troubling, however, was what was happening to their children. They were starting to forget what it meant to be English. They were becoming Dutch. The separatists had left their home for their faith, but they couldn't bear to lose their identity. They decided they had to move again. This time, across the Atlantic Ocean, to the New World. It was an audacious, almost insane idea. Every previous attempt to start a permanent English colony in North America, with the exception of the struggling settlement at Jamestown, had failed. Jamestown itself was a horror story. In its first year, 70 of the 108 settlers died. During a period known as the Starving Time, 440 out of 500 settlers perished in just 6 months. And then there were the stories they read about the Native Americans, who were said to delight in flaying men alive with seashells. How could parents willingly subject their children to such a fate? In the end, their answer was simple: they believed God wanted them to go. They saw themselves as modern-day pilgrims on a divine mission, destined to plant a godly English society in the American wilderness. As William Bradford would later write, they knew they were pilgrims. Getting to America proved to be an ordeal. They were swindled by a smooth-talking London merchant named Thomas Weston, who changed the terms of their financial agreement at the last minute, making them feel more like bondslaves than honest men. They bought a small ship called the Speedwell to accompany the larger vessel Weston had hired, the Mayflower. But the Speedwell leaked so badly that it had to be abandoned. It was later discovered that the ship's master, a man named Reynolds, had deliberately sabotaged the vessel, likely as part of a plot by the Dutch to keep the English from settling near their intended territory around the Hudson River. After months of agonizing delays, the laden congregation was down to just over 50 people, about half of the total passengers who were now crammed onto the Mayflower. The others were a mix of merchants, craftsmen, and servants recruited by the investors in London, a group the Pilgrims referred to as the Strangers. On September 6, 1620, the Mayflower finally set out alone from Plymouth, England. For 65 days, she battled storms and headwinds. The passengers, 102 men, women, and children, plus 2 dogs, were packed into a dark, airless space between decks that was less than 5 feet high. Sickness was rampant. The ship leaked constantly, spewing salt water onto their heads. In the middle of the ocean, a massive wave cracked one of the ship's main support beams. The captain considered turning back, but the Pilgrims, using a giant screwjack they had brought to build houses, managed to hoist the beam back into place, saving the voyage. Then, on the morning of November 9th, after more than 2 months at sea, they spotted land. It was the sandy arm of Cape Cod, far north of their intended destination near the Hudson River. The captain, Christopher Jones, turned the ship south, but he soon found himself sailing into a nightmare of dangerous shoals and roaring breakers. It was a maze of sandbars off the coast of modern-day Chatham, a place so treacherous it's been said that half the shipwrecks on the entire Atlantic coast have occurred there. With the wind dying and daylight fading, Jones was trapped. Just when it seemed the Mayflower was doomed, the wind shifted, and he was able to escape. Shaken by the near disaster, Jones made a fateful decision. He would not risk the journey south again. They would stay and settle in New England. This decision threw the ship into an uproar. Some of the strangers argued that since they were not landing in the territory granted by their patent, the rules no longer applied. Once they reached shore, they declared, they would use their own liberty, for none had power to command them. The entire venture was on the brink of collapse before a single foot had touched dry land. What happened next was remarkable. Instead of responding with force, the Pilgrim leaders responded with an idea. Drawing on the concept of a covenant, a sacred agreement that was the foundation of their church, they decided to create a civil covenant. They drafted a short document, a promise to combine ourselves together into a civil body politic and to obey the laws created for the general good of the colony. This document, known today as the Mayflower Compact, was revolutionary. It was a government created not by a king or by God, but by the people themselves. On November 11, 1620, before anyone left the ship, 41 men signed the agreement. They then elected John Carver, a respected deacon, as their first governor. With that single act of pragmatic unity, they saved their colony from anarchy. They anchored in what is now Provincetown Harbor. After months at sea, the sight of solid ground was a relief, but what they saw was a hideous and desolate wilderness. Bradford would later write of their condition with awe. They had no friends to welcome them, no houses to repair to, and winter was coming. In the next 4 months, half of them would be dead. For the next month, they explored the cold, sandy landscape of Cape Cod, searching for a place to build their settlement. They had their first brief, frightening encounter with the natives, who fired arrows at them from the woods. And they made a discovery that would save their lives. They found baskets of Indian corn, buried in the sand for winter storage. Knowing they would starve without it, they took the corn, vowing to repay the owners if they ever met them. Finally, in mid-December, a small exploring party was caught in a brutal storm. Their rudder broke, their mast shattered, and they were nearly driven onto a beach in the freezing darkness. But they managed to find shelter on a small island, and on Monday, December 11th, they rowed across the bay to a place with a protected harbor, running brooks, and fields already cleared for planting. They had found their home. They would call it Plymouth. But for William Bradford, the good news was met with personal tragedy. When he returned to the Mayflower, he learned that his wife, Dorothy, had fallen from the ship and drowned in the cold waters of the harbor. He never wrote about her death, but the loss must have been devastating, especially since they had left their 3-year-old son behind in Holland. The first winter was a living hell. Scurvy, pneumonia, and other diseases swept through the small community. At the peak of the sickness, only 6 or 7 people were healthy enough to care for the dying. The dead were buried at night in unmarked graves on Coles Hill, so the watching natives would not know how weakened they had become. By spring, 52 of the original 102 passengers were dead. Through all of this, they had seen signs of the local inhabitants, but no one had dared to approach them. This was the land of the Patuxet people, but what the Pilgrims didn't know was that a devastating plague between 1616 and 1619 had wiped out as much as 90% of the native population along the New England coast. Plymouth was a ghost town, littered with the sun-bleached skulls and bones of the dead. The leader of the dominant tribe in the region, the Pokanokets, was a powerful sachem named Massasoit. The plague had ravaged his people, reducing his fighting force from 3,000 to just a few hundred warriors. Meanwhile, their rivals, the Narragansetts to the west, had been untouched by the disease and were now far more powerful. Massasoit was in a desperate struggle for survival. When the Mayflower arrived, he saw not a threat, but a potential opportunity. These Englishmen, with their powerful muskets, could be the allies he needed to hold off the Narragansetts. In March of 1621, a tall, naked native man strode boldly into the half-built Plymouth settlement and boomed, "Welcome, Englishmen." His name was Samoset, a visiting sachem from Maine who had learned some English from fishermen. A few days later, he returned with the man who would change everything, Squanto. Squanto's life story was incredible. He was one of the last surviving Patuxet, the very people who had once lived at Plymouth. In 1614, he had been kidnapped by an English captain and sold into slavery in Spain. He eventually made his way to London, learned English, and finally managed to get passage back to his homeland in 1619 only to find that everyone he had ever known was dead. Squanto served as the interpreter for Massasoit's first meeting with the Pilgrims. After a formal ceremony, Governor Carver and Massasoit agreed to a treaty of mutual defense. If anyone unjustly attacked one of them, the other would come to their aid. It was an alliance born of mutual desperation, and it would hold for more than 50 years. Squanto stayed with the Pilgrims, teaching them how to plant their stolen corn using herring as fertilizer, and how to fish for eels in the mud of the tidal creeks. He became, as Bradford wrote, a special instrument sent of God for their good. But Squanto also had his own agenda. He secretly played the English and the Poconokeets against each other, telling other tribes that the Pilgrims kept the plague buried in barrels and that he alone could convince them to unleash it. His goal was to usurp Massasoit and become the most powerful sachem in the region. When his plot was discovered, Massasoit furiously demanded Squanto's execution, but Bradford refused to give him up, valuing his interpreter too highly. In the fall of 1621, after a successful harvest of their Indian corn, the Pilgrims celebrated. Bradford sent 4 men out hunting for fowl, and Massasoit arrived with 90 of his own men and 5 deer. For 3 days, the English and the Poconokeets feasted, played games, and fired their muskets in celebration. This was the event we now call the First Thanksgiving. It was not a somber religious affair, but a secular harvest festival, a moment of profound relief and genuine goodwill between two peoples who had, against all odds, managed to survive. But this moment of peace was just the beginning of a much longer, more complicated story. The 55 years that followed were a time of what Philbrick calls accommodation. The relationship was a dynamic process of struggle, compromise, and constant negotiation. As long as both sides recognized that they needed each other, there was peace. But the world was changing. The Great Migration of Puritans to Massachusetts Bay in the 1630s brought thousands of new English settlers to New England. Plymouth, once the center of the English world in America, became a backwater, surrounded by larger, more prosperous colonies. To Governor Bradford's dismay, his tight-knit community began to splinter as families moved away in search of more land. This hunger for land put immense pressure on the native population. Massasoit, to maintain his status and acquire English goods like tools, blankets, and guns, began to sell off vast tracts of territory. Though Plymouth officials insisted that every parcel was fairly purchased, the system was designed to keep prices artificially low, and the Indians were slowly being pushed out of their own homeland. When Massasoit died around 1661, and William Bradford just a few years earlier in 1657, the leadership passed to a new generation, a generation that had not experienced the desperate codependence of those first years. The new governor of Plymouth was Josiah Winslow, son of the Pilgrim diplomat Edward Winslow. Ambitious and arrogant, Josiah represented a new English attitude that saw the Indians not as partners, but as an obstacle to prosperity. Massasoit's heir was his eldest son, Wamsuta, who took the English name Alexander. In 1662, Winslow, then the colony's chief military officer, heard rumors that Alexander was plotting with the Narragansetts. He marched to Alexander's hunting lodge, burst into his wigwam, and, according to some accounts, held a pistol to the sachem's chest, forcing him to come to Plymouth for questioning. Shortly after, Alexander fell violently ill and died. His younger brother, Metacom, whom the English called Philip, was convinced that Winslow had poisoned him. From that moment on, a deep and personal hatred burned between the two men who were now the leaders of their respective peoples. Philip was just 24 when he became sachem. He was proud and haughty, but he also knew his people were weak. For the next decade, he walked a tightrope. He continued to sell land to pay for English goods and maintain his status, while simultaneously trying to resist the colonists' ever-increasing demands. But the pressure was relentless. The colonists' livestock destroyed native cornfields. The English legal system was used to chip away at native sovereignty. By 1671, Philip's young warriors were demanding action. He began making preparations for war, but was forced by Plymouth officials to sign a humiliating treaty, surrendering his people's guns and acknowledging himself as a subject of the colony. It was a total capitulation, and it convinced Philip that peace was no longer an option. He began using the money from his last land sales to secretly buy more weapons. The final spark came in January 1675. A praying Indian named John Sassaman, a man who had once served as Philip's interpreter but was now distrusted by him, went to Governor Winslow. He warned him that Philip was preparing for war. Winslow dismissed the warning. A few weeks later, Sassaman's body was found under the ice of a frozen pond. Winslow, now believing Sassaman, launched an investigation. An Indian witness came forward, claiming he had seen 3 of Philip's senior men murder Sassaman. The 3 men were put on trial in Plymouth. Despite the fact that English law required 2 witnesses and they only had 1, and a dubious one at that, the jury of 12 Englishmen and 6 praying Indians found all 3 men guilty. On June 8, 1675, 2 of the men were hanged. When the rope broke during the execution of the 3rd, the terrified man confessed to save his own life, providing the authorities with the 2nd witness they needed. A month later, he was shot. For Philip and his warriors, the trial was the ultimate insult, a gross violation of their sovereignty. The time for talk was over. Young warriors, hungry for revenge, began to pillage English farms in the town of Swansea, which bordered Philip's territory at Mount Hope. The powwows had predicted that the Indians would be victorious if the English fired the first shot. On June 23, an English boy shot and killed an Indian who was looting his family's abandoned home. The war had begun. What followed was 14 months of unimaginable horror. King Philip's War engulfed all of New England, from the farthest settlements in Maine to the Connecticut River Valley. This was not a war fought on open battlefields. It was a war of ambushes, of terrifying raids on isolated farmhouses, and of brutal massacres. The English, trained for European-style warfare, were initially useless in the forests and swamps of New England. The Indians, using what was called a skulking way of war, were masters of concealment and surprise. In the war's first year, the native alliance was astonishingly successful. They laid waste to town after town. Brookfield, Lancaster, Medfield, Groton, and Sudbury were all burned. Captives like Mary Rowlandson, a minister's wife from Lancaster, were taken in raids and forced to endure a grievous captivity. A third of all English towns in New England were burned and abandoned. There was even a proposal to build a wall around Boston and surrender the rest of the country to Philip. But the English had advantages the Indians did not. They had larger food reserves and a continuous supply of arms and ammunition from England. The Indians, on the other hand, were fighting a war while trying to feed their families. As the war dragged on, starvation became as great an enemy as the English. The turning point came with the Great Swamp Fight in December 1675. The powerful Narragansett tribe had remained neutral, but the English, fueled by paranoia, decided they couldn't be trusted. A combined army of 1,000 soldiers from Massachusetts, Plymouth, and Connecticut launched a preemptive strike on a massive, fortified Narragansett village hidden deep within a frozen swamp in Rhode Island. The battle was a bloodbath for both sides. The English suffered devastating casualties, but they succeeded in burning the fort to the ground, killing hundreds of Narragansett men, women, and children. The attack pushed the surviving Narragansetts into the war, but it also destroyed their winter food supply, crippling them for the months to come. It was also in this war that a new kind of American hero emerged, Benjamin Church. A carpenter from Plymouth, he was one of the few Englishmen who understood and respected native ways of fighting. While other commanders disdained using Indian allies, Church built his company around them. He learned to move through the woods silently, to fight from cover, and to think like his enemy. In the summer of 1676, Church convinced the Sakonnet tribe, led by the female sachem Awashanks, to switch sides and fight with him. With his mixed company of English volunteers and Sakonnet warriors, Church began to turn the tide in Plymouth colony. He hunted down Philip relentlessly, capturing hundreds of his followers. The end for Philip came on August 12, 1676. Betrayed by one of his own men, Philip was trapped in a swamp at the base of Mount Hope, his ancestral home. As he tried to flee, he was shot and killed, not by an Englishman, but by a Pecasset Indian named Alderman, whose brother Philip had recently executed for suggesting they surrender. In a final act of desecration, Church ordered that Philip's body be beheaded and quartered. His head was sent to Plymouth, where it was mounted on a pole on Fort Hill, a grim trophy that would remain on display for over 2 decades. Philip's 9-year-old son and his wife were sold into slavery, along with thousands of other Native Americans. The war was over, but the cost was staggering. In terms of percentage of population killed, it was more than twice as bloody as the American Civil War. The Native American population of southern New England was reduced by as much as 80%. The dream of 2 cultures living side by side was gone, replaced by a legacy of bitterness, fear, and racial hatred that would shape the country for centuries to come. The journey that had begun with one ship, the Mayflower, had ended with another, the Seaflower. Commentary. So, what do we take away from this powerful, and often heartbreaking, story? It's easy to feel a sense of distance from these events, to see them as something that happened a long, long time ago. But Nathaniel Philbrick's great achievement in Mayflower is to show us that this isn't just a story about the past. It's a story about us. The journey of the Pilgrims is the quintessential American story of reinvention. They were people who left everything behind in search of a new life, a place where they could be free. But their quest for freedom, as we've seen, ultimately led to the conquest and enslavement of another people. This is the central paradox of American history, a conflict between our highest ideals and our darkest actions that we are still wrestling with today. What's so compelling about the first 50 years of Plymouth is that for a brief, shining moment, it seemed like a different path was possible. The alliance between Governor Bradford and Massasoit was not perfect, but it was real. It was built on mutual respect, mutual need, and a willingness to engage in the difficult, frustrating work of diplomacy. They understood something that their children forgot, that survival depended on their ability to accommodate one another. The tragedy of King Philip's War is the tragedy of lost memory. The second generation, both English and Native, inherited a world their parents had built, but they didn't inherit the wisdom that came from building it. Josiah Winslow and his contemporaries saw the Indians as an inconvenience, a roadblock to progress. Philip and his warriors saw the English as invaders who had broken their promises. Both sides stopped listening to each other. They began to see the other not as complex human beings, but as one-dimensional enemies. And in that failure of imagination, the war became inevitable. The great lesson of Mayflower is a lesson in empathy. It's a call to look beyond the simple myths we tell ourselves about who we are and where we come from. History is never as simple as heroes and villains. It's a messy, complicated, and often tragic story of flawed human beings trying to do their best in difficult circumstances. The Pilgrims were not saints, and the Native Americans were not savages. They were people, bound together by a shared geography and a shared, and often painful, destiny. So, how can we apply this to our own lives? I think it starts with a simple act, questioning the stories we've been told. Think about the history of your own town, your own family. What parts of the story are celebrated, and what parts are left out? Who are the heroes, and are there voices that have been silenced? By seeking out the full story, the complicated story, we honor the humanity of everyone involved. And perhaps most importantly, We can learn from the 50 years of peace, not just the 14 months of war. Peace is not a passive state, it's an active process. It requires patience, compromise, and the courage to see the world from someone else's perspective. It's the hard, unglamorous work of listening, of understanding, and of recognizing that our own survival is inextricably linked to the survival of others. That was the hard-won wisdom of the first generation at Plymouth. And it's a wisdom we need today more than ever. That was a summary of Mayflower, a story of courage, community, and war by Nathaniel Philbrick. We've journeyed through the main narrative today, but I have to be honest with you, a summary can never truly capture the full power of a book like this. The real magic happens when you immerse yourself in the world the author creates. It's in the small details, the vivid descriptions of a brutal winter, the raw emotion in a leader's voice, that the past truly comes alive. This overview is meant to give you a foundation and help you see if this is a story you want to explore more deeply. If anything we've discussed today has sparked your curiosity or challenged what you thought you knew, I encourage you to pick up a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning history, it's an experience that can genuinely change how you understand the foundations of America and the timeless complexities of the human heart. And, if you found this journey valuable, please consider liking this podcast and subscribing to our channel. It helps us continue to bring these incredible stories to light, and ensures you won't miss our next exploration of a book from the billionaire's bookshelf. Let's continue to learn and grow together.